better, and our pace is going to be better when we're better defensively.
She immediately... Stephanie White will not say Caitlin Clark's name. That is not a theory. That is not a narrative. That is a documented, undeniable, on-camera pattern that the Indiana Fever organization has been quietly scrambling to manage. And last night, that scramble became so visible, so embarrassingly transparent, that the franchise did something that nobody in professional basketball should ever have to do. They brought in a separate staff member specifically to acknowledge their own franchise player's performance in the post-game locker room, because the head coach could not do it herself. Welcome back. This is Rimrun, and today we are documenting the single most bizarre, most revealing, most catastrophic coaching failure in this Indiana Fever season. The night Stephanie White was so allergic to Caitlin Clark's name that the organization was forced to deploy a brand new face to deliver the credit that the head coach refused to give.
14 assists in just 17.
I thought it was really good. She did a great job of finding her teammates. Again, her pace. You can tell she's got her burst back.
Let me lay out exactly what is at stake here, because this is bigger than one post-game press conference and bigger than one awkward locker room moment. This is about a franchise that is actively at war with its own identity. The Indiana Fever for most of this season have been a disaster, an absolute soul-crushing, baffling disaster. And the reason, the core, undeniable reason, is that for the majority of the season, this organization refused to fully commit to playing through the one player who can actually save them. They refused to build the offense around Caitlin Clark. They refused to let her dictate tempo. They refused to let her be what she is, which is one of the most gifted offensive orchestrators this league has seen in a generation. But something shifted in the last 4 games. The Fever finally conceded. They finally said, fine, we are going to play Caitlin Clark basketball. And what happened? They won. The offense exploded. The team connected on both ends of the floor. They scored 113 points in regulation, a franchise record according to the post-game locker room breakdown. 113 in regulation. And Caitlin Clark had 21 points and 14 assists. 14. She was not just playing well. She was dictating the entire tempo of that basketball game. She was the engine. She was the architect. Every good thing that happened offensively ran directly through her hands. And Stephanie White could not bring herself to say the woman's name when the cameras were on. That is what we are here to talk about today. That is the conversation that television will not have with you. That is the part of the story that the press release skipped entirely. So let us get into it.
This is where we have to grow. We have to understand that every possession matters. I think there was a couple, and I think it was early the 4th, I don't remember exactly, and I called timeout, and I was just addressing it. We're not going to do this. Okay, every possession matters.
Here is what actually happened in the post-game, and I want you to follow this sequence carefully because every detail matters. The Fever had just put up 113 points in regulation, a franchise record. The locker room celebration was happening, the post-game breakdown was happening, and the Indiana Fever organization, in what can only be described as a stunning organizational acknowledgement of their own head coach's limitations, had a separate staff member, someone who apparently was not the head coach, step forward to deliver the team's statistical highlights. This individual rattled off the assist rate, which was 69%, 4 players in double figures, scoring runs of 28, 12, 17, 4. He mentioned Kelsey Mitchell. He mentioned that Caitlin Clark had moved up to 2nd in franchise history for assists in a single game. He said it. He said her name. He gave her the credit. He did the job that the head coach of the Indiana Fever has repeatedly, demonstrably, catastrophically refused to do. Now think about what that means for 1 second. Think about the organizational decision-making that had to happen behind closed doors for that to become the solution. Someone in that building, someone with authority, looked at the pattern of Stephanie White's post-game behavior, looked at the public reaction, looked at the blowback and said, we cannot let her handle this alone anymore. We need someone else in that room to make sure Caitlin Clark gets acknowledged. That is not a small thing. That is a franchise admitting in the most visible way possible that their head coach has a Caitlin Clark problem. And the solution they landed on was to bring in a designated acknowledgement specialist, a shout-out coordinator, a person whose entire function in that post-game moment was to say the name that Stephanie White would not say. And even then, even with this new system in place, even with this organizational workaround designed specifically to protect Caitlin Clark's public recognition, Stephanie White still botched the press conference. She still could not get through the media availability without making it obvious that she would rather talk about anything, literally anything, other than what Caitlin Clark did on that basketball court. Don't take my word for it. Here is exactly what Stephanie White said when the media asked her directly about the offense. After 113 points, after 21 points and 14 assists from her point guard, after a franchise record night, listen to where she goes.
Better, and our pace is going to be better when we're better defensively.
She went to the defense. She went straight to the defense. A reporter asked her what she saw humming offensively, and Stephanie White's first instinct, her automatic, unfiltered, uncoached instinct, was to talk about the defensive end of the floor. After a franchise record offensive performance, after her point guard orchestrated 14 assists, she said, and I want you to hear this clearly, our pace is going to be better when we are better defensively. That is where her mind went. That is what she led with. Not Caitlin Clark. Not the 21 points. Not the 14 assists. Not the franchise record. Defense. She went to defense. There is no spin to put on that. None. That is the admission. That is the evidence. That is Stephanie White on camera with reporters in the room choosing to redirect a question about the best offensive performance in franchise history toward a subject that had nothing to do with the person who made that performance happen. And that is just the beginning of what happened in that press conference.
14 assists in just 7 seconds.
I thought it was really good. She did a great job of finding her teammates. Again, her pace. You can tell she's got her burst back.
Let me walk you through the full pattern of that post-game availability, because what Stephanie White did was not a one-time slip. It was a sustained, deliberate, almost choreographed effort to discuss every single aspect of that game without crediting the player who was most responsible for the outcome. Pass 1. The tactical failure in real time. When the reporter asked about the offense, Stephanie White went to the defense. We already covered that. But then she kept going. She talked about pace. She talked about fouls and free throw opportunities. She talked about ball movement and paint touches and ball reversals. All of that is legitimate basketball analysis. None of it is wrong as a standalone answer. But here is the problem. All of it is generic. All of it is systemic. All of it is the kind of answer a coach gives when they want to appear engaged with the question without actually answering the question that was asked. The question was about the offense. The offense ran through Caitlin Clark. The answer should have included Caitlin Clark. It did not. Not once. Not even a glancing reference. Stephanie White talked about paint touches and ball reversals and free throw rates for what felt like an eternity, and the name Caitlin Clark never entered the conversation. Think about how deliberate that has to be. Think about how much mental energy it takes to answer a question about an offense that your point guard just ran for a franchise record night, and to construct an entire answer, a detailed, statistically flavored answer that never once mentions the point guard. That is not an accident. That is not a slip. That is a choice. A ruthless, glaring, baffling choice that the people who run this franchise have apparently decided they are powerless to stop. Pass 2. The pattern of behavior and why this is not new. This is not the first time. Let me be entirely clear with you. This pattern of Stephanie White refusing to publicly credit Caitlin Clark in post-game situations is documented. It is established. It is the reason the Indiana Fever organization felt compelled to bring in a separate staff member to handle locker room acknowledgments in the first place. You do not create a workaround for a problem that does not exist. You do not deploy a designated shout-out coordinator unless the person who is supposed to be doing the shouting out has repeatedly, demonstrably failed to do it. The organizational response to Stephanie White's behavior is itself proof of the pattern. The franchise saw it. The franchise acknowledged it internally. The franchise acted on it. And still, Stephanie White managed to botch the press conference anyway. Earlier in the season, the same dynamic played out. Stephanie White could find the words to praise other players. She could call out performances from other members of the roster. She could discuss team stats and collective effort and systemic improvements. But when it came to Caitlin Clark specifically, there was always a gap, always a redirect, always a pivot to something adjacent, something systemic, something that allowed her to discuss the game without naming the player who was most responsible for the outcome. That gap is not a coincidence. That gap is a pattern. And patterns do not lie. Pass 3, the enabler complicity, and what the organization's response actually tells us. Here is the part of this story that nobody on television will say out loud. By deploying a separate staff member to handle Caitlin Clark's acknowledgement in the post-game locker room, the Indiana Fever organization did not solve the problem. They institutionalized it. They looked at Stephanie White's refusal to publicly credit their franchise player and said, okay, we cannot fix this, so let us build a system around it. Let us add a person whose job is to do the thing the head coach will not do. And in doing so, they made a catastrophic admission. They admitted that they know the problem exists. They admitted that they have tried to address it. They admitted that the head coach's behavior in post-game situations has become so reliably problematic that it requires a structural organizational response. That is not a vote of confidence in Stephanie White. That is the opposite of a vote of confidence. That is the franchise quietly, without a press release, without a formal announcement, without any public acknowledgement, signaling that they do not trust their own head coach to handle the most basic responsibility of her public-facing role. And the fact that they felt they needed to do this, the fact that this became the solution, tells you everything you need to know about the state of this coaching situation. Pass 4. The cost to Caitlin Clark and why this matters beyond the optics. I want every single person watching this video to sit with this for a moment. Caitlin Clark put up 21 points and 14 assists in a franchise record offensive performance, 14 assists. She was not just scoring, she was finding teammates, she was creating opportunities. She was forcing the action, pushing pace, running the offense. And after all of that, after a performance that by any objective measure was the most important individual contribution to a franchise record night, she had to watch her head coach stand in front of reporters and talk about paint touches and ball reversals and defensive free throw rates without once saying her name. Do you understand what that does to a player? Do you understand the message that sends, not just to Caitlin Clark, but to every other player in that locker room? The message is, the head coach does not want to give you credit in public. The message is, you can have a franchise record night and your coach will still find a way to make it about something else. The message is, the organizational culture around this team has a Caitlin Clark problem that goes all the way to the top of the coaching staff. And that is a soul-crushing reality for a player who is clearly, demonstrably, undeniably the reason this franchise has any hope of being relevant.
This is where we have to grow. We have to understand that every possession matters. I think there was a couple, and I think it was early the fourth, I don't remember exactly, and I called timeout, and I was just addressing it. We're not going to do this. Okay, every possession matters.
But here is where the press conference got even more revealing. Because after Stephanie White spent the first portion of her availability talking about defense and ball movement and systemic offense without mentioning Caitlin Clark, the reporters did not let it go. They pushed. They asked specifically about Sophie, another player who had a strong game, and Stephanie White had no trouble at all talking about Sophie. She talked about Sophie's ability to space the floor. She talked about Sophie's ability to break down defenses. She talked about Sophie's leadership. The words came easily. The praise was natural. The acknowledgement was immediate and enthusiastic. And then, only after being specifically asked about Caitlin Clark by name, only after a reporter essentially forced the issue, did Stephanie White finally, reluctantly, minimally address what Caitlin Clark had done. And even then, listen to how she framed it. Even when cornered, even when the question was directly about Caitlin Clark's floor game and her ability to affect the game positively with 14 assists, the answer was technically accurate but emotionally empty. She said Caitlin did a great job of finding teammates. She mentioned pace. She mentioned ball screen action. It was the kind of answer you give when you are legally required to say something but spiritually unwilling to mean it. And here is the clip that proves it. Here is the moment where the reporter had to pin Stephanie White into a corner, had to specifically frame the question around Caitlin Clark's 14 assists and overall floor game. Before Stephanie White would say anything at all, watch what she gives when she has no other option. She said it. Only after being cornered. Only after the reporter specifically framed the question around 14 assists and the overall floor game. Only after there was literally no other direction to pivot. And even then, even in that forced, reluctant, backed into a corner moment, the answer was flat. It was measured. It was the bare minimum. There was no enthusiasm. There was no spontaneous acknowledgement. There was no moment where Stephanie White said, "You know what, I have to be honest with you, Caitlin was unbelievable tonight." None of that. What she gave was the equivalent of a legal settlement, the smallest possible amount of credit that would satisfy the obligation without admitting any real wrongdoing. Let me say it back to you so you do not miss it. The head coach of the Indiana Fever, after a franchise record offensive performance driven by her point guard's 21 points and 14 assists, had to be specifically, directly, repeatedly asked about that point guard before she would say anything about her. And when she finally said something, it was the minimum, the absolute floor of acknowledgement, the least she could give while still technically answering the question. That is what this franchise is dealing with. That is the catastrophic, undeniable, on-camera reality of what Stephanie White has become as a public-facing head coach. Now let me render the verdict here, because I think it is important to be precise about what this all means going forward. First, the Stephanie White era of this style, the era where she can suppress Caitlin Clark's public recognition without organizational consequence, is over. It is dead. The moment the Indiana Fever brought in a separate staff member to handle locker room acknowledgments, they drew a line. They said implicitly that this behavior is no longer acceptable enough to go unaddressed. They did not fire her. They did not publicly call her out, but they acted. And the fact that they acted is the signal. The franchise knows, the front office knows, and the next time Stephanie White stands in front of a camera and pivots away from Caitlin Clark's name, there will be one fewer excuse available to the people who are supposed to be managing this situation. Second, the Fever's recent run, the last 4 games where they have committed to playing Caitlin Clark basketball, is the proof of concept that should have been obvious from day one. When this team plays through Caitlin Clark, they score 113 points in regulation. They put up franchise records. They win. The formula is not complicated. The formula is not mysterious. The formula is, give the ball to Caitlin Clark, let her push pace, let her create, let her dictate tempo, and get out of the way. That formula works. It has been working. And the only thing standing between this team and consistent success is the organizational will to commit to it fully, including in the post-game press conference, where the head coach is supposed to be the loudest voice in the room celebrating what her players did. Third, and this is the prediction I want to go on record with, the shout-out coordinator situation is not a sustainable solution. You cannot run a professional basketball franchise with a designated acknowledgement specialist whose job is to compensate for the head coach's emotional unwillingness to credit the franchise player. That is not a long-term organizational structure. That is a band-aid on a wound that requires surgery. And eventually, sooner rather than later, the Indiana Fever are going to have to make a decision about whether Stephanie White's coaching ability outweighs the very real, very documented, very public cost of her Caitlin Clark problem. Because right now, every post-game press conference is a liability. Every media availability is a moment where the franchise holds its breath and hopes the head coach doesn't make it worse. That is not a healthy organizational dynamic. That is a crisis being managed one game at a time. And here is the clip I want to leave you with. Because after everything, after the defense pivot, after the Sophie praise, after being cornered into a minimal acknowledgement, Stephanie White was asked one more question. She was asked about building and protecting leads, about what the team did differently in the third quarter to keep the momentum going. And her answer was about timeouts and possessions and not being careless with the basketball. All legitimate coaching points, none of them wrong. But in that entire answer, in that entire final opportunity to reflect on what her team had just accomplished, Caitlin Clark's name did not come up, not once. And I want you to hear it directly, because this is the moment that tells you everything about where Stephanie White's head is at even after a franchise record night. Every possession matters. That is what she said. Every possession matters offensively and defensively. We cannot have lapses. We cannot be careless. And I agree with all of that. I genuinely agree with all of that as a coaching philosophy. But here is the thing. Every possession matters, and the player who is most responsible for making those possessions count, the player who had 14 assists and 21 points and moved up to second in franchise history for assists in a single game, did not get a single spontaneous, unprompted, enthusiastic mention in that entire press conference. Not one. That is the brutal, undeniable, on-camera reality of what Stephanie White delivered last night. A franchise record performance from Caitlin Clark. And the head coach's post-game response was to talk about defensive pace, ball reversals, Sophie's floor spacing, and possession discipline. The name Caitlin Clark had to be extracted from her by reporters asking direct questions. The credit had to be pulled out of her like a splinter, and even then, it came out flat and measured and minimum. Meanwhile, Caitlin Clark is out there doing the work. 21 points, 14 assists, a franchise record night, playing through whatever physical challenges she is managing. And the transcript makes clear she is playing through something because reporters asked about it and the answer confirmed she is tough as nails and never complains. She is out there competing, creating, winning, and doing it in a building where her own head coach treats her name like something to be avoided in public. That is the situation. That is the reality. And it is not going to fix itself. The Indiana Fever organization made a move. They brought in someone to do what Stephanie White would not do. But a shout-out coordinator is not a coaching staff overhaul. A locker room acknowledgement specialist is not a cultural reset. The real fix requires something bigger, something more honest, something that the people who run this franchise are going to have to reckon with, whether they want to or not. Because Caitlin Clark is not going anywhere. She is going to keep putting up 21 and 14. She is going to keep moving up the franchise history books. She is going to keep being the reason this team scores 113 in regulation. And every single time that happens, the question of whether Stephanie White can publicly acknowledge it, without being cornered, without being forced, without a designated specialist standing next to her to fill the gap, is going to be right back in the spotlight. The Stephanie White style of play is dead. The era of suppressing Caitlin Clark's public recognition is collapsing in real time. And the entire balance of power in that building just shifted, one franchise record night at a time. Here is your forced choice for today, and I want you to drop it in the comments right now. 2 options only. Option 1. The Indiana Fever organization addresses the Stephanie White situation before the end of this season, whether that means a formal conversation, a structural change, or something more significant, because the shoutout coordinator solution is not sustainable and they know it. Option 2. Stephanie White survives the season. The Fever continue to manage the situation game by game with organizational workarounds. And this exact same post-game dynamic plays out again the next time Caitlin Clark has a franchise record performance. Which one is it? Drop it below. Because I want to know where you stand on this, and I want to know whether you think the Indiana Fever have the organizational courage to actually fix what is clearly, visibly, undeniably broken. This is Rimrun. If this video gave you something to think about, hit that like button right now, subscribe if you are not already on the channel, and ring that notification bell so you do not miss the next one. Because this story is not over, and we will be here every time it moves.